Know what to eat, but find yourself not eating it. Perhaps you've been on diets and off again and just wonder why you can't stick to them. The Eating For You podcast, hosted by me, Sally-Anne Pisk, will show you what's been missing so you can enjoy a healthier way of eating that lasts. Hi, Sally-Anne with you today, and I'm very excited to have Rosemary Clancy with me today. She's a clinical psychologist and specialises in sleep. Welcome, Rosemary.
Hi, Sally-Anne. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes, as I've shared very recently on the podcast, sleep is one of my favourite activities to boost my health and well-being. But of course, we're having this discussion today in two parts, looking at healthy sleep and the impact of shift work. And then we're going to be doing a second part on menopause. So I'm well aware sleep does not come easy for everyone, does it?
No, this is such an issue that the neuroscientist Matthew Walker from Stanford, about 60 to 70% of people have a difficulty falling asleep one night a week, every single week. That makes it normal. And I think what is useful for us is to not see this as anything normal when it happens. It's only if it becomes chronic and really starts to affect our quality of life and our functioning that we start to kind of talk about this as a disorder.
Yes, yeah. And tell me, Rosemary, how did you develop an interest in sleep as a clinical psychologist?
Well, I've been in the mental health field for probably 30 years now. After I finished my clinical psychology master's in Adelaide, I came to Sydney and I was working in a depression and anxiety clinic. It became really clear to me just how crucial sleep was in underpinning and increasing the chronicity or the feelings of helplessness people had around both mood and anxiety disorders. Because if you can't get a handle on sleep and you feel as though you're helpless to improve your sleep in any way, then it really will affect your mood and it'll affect your anxiety. People are chronically in worry and rumination, and worse, we condition that as a nighttime habit. So then it becomes sleep disruptive. If we add to that things like going to the bathroom a number of times at night, then we can really cement disrupted sleep at night.
Yes. Yeah. And I see it in my field of work as well, Rosemary, especially. I was just amazed when I first started doing talks when I had completed the Eating For You book, and women would come up to me after my speaking engagements and they'd say, Sally-Anne, I realise now I have a sleep problem. Yes, my eating's not crash hot, but I can see the core of my health at the moment, and the reason why I'm reaching for extra foods, especially those sugary and fatty foods, is I'm not sleeping well. And it's a real insight for people just to see, how important sleep is.
Yeah, and I think, you've touched on it there just with those feelings of chronic tiredness that seem to be a large part, well, there's certainly a large part of low mood, depressive disorders and anxiety disorders. So in the midst of this, you can generally see some disruption to sleep. And of course, it makes sense. If we feel tired, then we're going to be reaching for sugary foods to try and give us a burst of energy.
Yeah.
Then we find we just kind of perpetuate that whole unfortunate cycle, really.
That's right. Of course, with food, it has the opposite reaction as well. If we eat, heavy foods later in night, then that's not going to help us sleep either. So we see this a lot, I think, in these lifestyle choices we make. And the more we understand about that gut-brain connection, everything's a two-way relationship. It's not just this causes that. It's all this lovely, interesting little jigsaw puzzle for each of us to work out.
That's a good way to describe it, I think. A sort of jigsaw puzzle or mosaic of causes. Difficult sleep and their reciprocal relationship with daytime tiredness, eating habits that are not conducive to better sleep, overuse of caffeine. I'm guilty of that too. So you touched on the lifestyle changes that could make a real difference to sleep. Yes. And that's often where we start.
Yeah. Let's backtrack and let people understand what healthy sleep actually looks like, because we've mentioned already that natural sleep and healthy sleep doesn't mean we have a perfect 8 hours sleep every night. It's a bit all over the place, isn't it?
Well said. Yeah. Well, the first point I want to make is just that normal sleep is a range. It can differ. For most people, we're thinking something between 6 to 8 hours, but that changes over the lifetime as well. That as you become older, your sleep is more fragmented with more wakings in the latter half of the night, especially by the time you reach your 60s and 70s. So if you feel that waking isn't normal during sleep, then maybe you'd want to be you'd be trying sedatives to try and stamp that out. When some acceptance of your wakings, short awakenings in the latter half of the night as you get to your older years is going to be helpful here. A lot of what I do is acceptance strategies in the face of the normal changes to sleep throughout our lifetime, but especially as we get to midlife. But so normal range seems to be something between 6 to 9 hours. There are genetic short sleepers noted in the research who are quite refreshed on 4 to 5 hours a night, long term. They're a small subgroup over on one side, and most people would seem to need at least 6.5 and feel comfortable or refreshed with that. Within normal sleep too, we're going to have normal wakings at night. They're generally short wakings, and we still have enough sleep drive to resume sleep again. The difficulty might be, though, if we start to condition a pattern of worry or rumination with those wakings during the night, that we can sort of cement that as a habit and then start to affect our mood and our anxiety levels because it is sleep disruptive. And that's the thing about us as humans. We don't know if we're going to be awake for 2 minutes in the middle of the night or 2 hours, and we could very easily make it 2 hours if we started ruminating and worrying. So normal sleep, most people tend to go to sleep about 9, 10, midnight. It's suggested that in terms of cardiovascular health, if you can ensure that you're beginning your sleep before 1 a.m., then there's the least number of health risks attached to that. For most people, they're imagining something like 7 to 8 hours between 10 and 6 or 10 and 5 a.m. or 11 and 7 in order to feel refreshed. I suppose normal sleep too is where you don't feel as though you have to try. It's very much something about just letting it happen. That's why I've called my website Let Sleep Happen as opposed to Make, because it is the oldest part of our brain that governs this. It's a midbrain autonomic function, sleeping and waking, just like your involuntary muscles of heart and lung muscle. You don't have to think about working them. You don't have to manually work them. They're working the entire time. You're breathing. We can speed up your heart rate somewhat by breathing faster. We could slow it down by breathing slower, but we can't stop those involuntary muscle groups, right? They're midbrain autonomic functions, right? The oldest part of our brain. So if you consider that sleeping and waking is also midbrain autonomic function, you don't have to control it. You can just hand over control to your midbrain. And part of what we're trying to do in an insomnia treatment is, as part of this acceptance piece, is allowing our midbrain to get on with its job and taking care of our onset of sleep because of our circadian and homeostatic drives working together to get us that sleep, and not getting our frontal cortex and executive function problem solving to step in the way and disrupt that. If we can, a normal sleep looks like just handing over control to the midbrain. Sure enough, if you have the merest ritual, what we call a bedtime routine, for many people, it's just brushing their teeth, and that's enough of an expectancy that our brain is saying, okay, I know what comes after this. There's a sleep expectancy. And then light goes off and we fall into sleep without having, it's effortless. We don't have to do anything about it. It may be that reading is part of that. Maybe you get a few minutes of reading in, but as soon as you open the book, the expectancy is already there and your brain is ready for sleep. So you end up falling asleep with your glasses askew, the page open, and that's the way sleep starts. It doesn't have to be controlled. We don't have to force it.
No, and I really love that sort of explanation of handing it over, to our midbrain, but just letting it happen. Yes, I'm glad you mentioned the name of your website because I thought it was a fabulous name.
Well, the first part of this, and just to continue on our thread of what normal sleep looks like, night, the first half of the night, you're going to be achieving without having to do any work towards it, by the way, you'll be achieving your slow wave sleep or deep sleep, right? And this is largely because your deep sleep at the beginning of the night is specifically linked to how long you've been awake in the day or days before it, building this huge wave of sleep drive, say a 16 to 18 hour wakefulness period during the day. Or if you've been awake for longer than that, having an even stronger wave of homeostatic sleep pressure. Hunger is homeostatic as well. If you eat, then your hunger is sated, but then you start building hunger again until you eat next meal. It really does work like a wave. This is the beautiful thing about normal sleep pattern, is that you can see how, one, the sun impacts on your physiology, and also this wave of homeostatic sleep pressure impacts on your physiology, and the two converge as a result of those physiological changes in response to light and dark that are happening, and you just fall into sleep. In relation to waking after that first slow wave sleep at the beginning of the night, which will take care of your physical recovery and tissue and cell repair and human growth hormone production, right? After that first bout of deep sleep, then we're going to have a natural waking period. Now, at that point, we usually just fall straight back to sleep again within a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes maybe, and we may not even remember waking. It's just not emotionally salient for us. Yes. Until it does become emotionally salient that we've woken. And if there's any threat attached to that, then we won't want that waking, right? Because it may feel like, well, now I've got to control getting back into sleep. And at this point, we'll probably have some recognition that there's a lesser sleep drive because so much of it has been resolved by that deep sleep. The second half of the night mainly features stage 1 and 2 light sleep, light non-REM sleep, and dream sleep can happen across the night, but it mostly happens in the second half of the night. And that's very important for memory consolidation and emotion regulation. Yes. And so what can happen is in the second half of the night, you'll have natural wakings occurring between stage 1 and 2 sleep and REM sleep. And if you wake up adjacent to your REM sleep, then you'll probably remember some of the narrative, which will invariably look disjointed and illogical, because the wonderful thing about REM sleep is there is an absence of frontal cortex involvement, position of logic or logical progression or narrative in that. It's highly visual because it's your visual cortex, the occipital cortex that is doing all the work there and providing these very vivid images in REM. These movies that we're looking at behind our eyelids during REM, this is responsible for your emotion regulation and not feeling irritable and cranky during the day. So I think as part of recognizing, again, normal sleep, the wakings themselves are normal, especially in the second half of the night, but it doesn't mean poor quality sleep, which is quite often the interpretation that people attach to those wakings. The light sleep and REM sleep as being somehow inferior. So it's normal to wake, but it's normal too every now and then if you're under a period of stress, or, if there's work stress, relationship stress, to have some level of ruminating about something that's happened, some shoulda, coulda, woulda thoughts, or some worry about, what do I do next? What if? With each of those, for maybe a night or maybe 2 nights, an hour or a couple of hours, and then the homeostatic sleep pressure will be such that the next night you get more sleep compensated for. Now, if you're under enough threat, there might be a few nights of mild sleep deprivation. It doesn't feel mild to us, of course, but it's a really interesting, and again, still normal, right? Because if you can imagine 40,000 years ago, what if sleep looked like that very often? You could only get a few hours of sleep once you got to safety before you had to be on the lookout for predators again. We know that you could go for a series of nights, say 2 nights, maybe even 3 nights of getting that slow wave sleep, right? So you get, say a 3-hour sleep, and then you're awake for the rest of the night and ruminating or worrying worrying, but you can still function that next day. By the third night, generally you're going to see the longer sleep because that homeostatic rhythm is still building in the background and your brain is constantly calibrating. Are we there yet in terms of how much sleep deprivation is this? How much homeostatic sleep pressure? And so what we call this is the homeostatic rhythm, that drive to sleep building over a couple of days.
And I think it's really good to understand that some rumination and problem solving in the middle of the night or the middle of the morning is quite normal as well. And I find with myself and speaking with a lot of my clients is if we've got some downtime through the day, you know, maybe it's some meditation or Tai Chi or reflection time, then we get to do some of this problem solving or we become a bit more aware of those deeper concerns. But if life gets busy and we forego that time through the day, then obviously the mind needs a quiet time to let you know and say, hey, you haven't fixed this yet, or oh, I've got a solution for this now.
Well said. I mean, that's right. Because one of the things that most people don't kind of consider is that you can train your worry and rumination from 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., provided you actually practice it.
That's
right. If you set yourself that worry session at 6 a.m. and you've got the still time so you can actually go, write your worry down and actually see it on paper and start problem solving that, then it will work that you have something to say to yourself, like at the next morning that you wake at 2 a.m., just because it's conditioned waking for 2 a.m. and it's been long practiced, you can say, look, I'm not able to think lucidly about this now because it's 2 a.m., but I could solve this in a tenth of the time at 6 a.m. So why don't I just leave it for my worry session there? And in that way, it is actually possible to train your worry from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m.
Yeah, lovely. Yes, I like that idea of that worry session with the solution focused, of course. I have worked in management previously, Rosemary, and I remember one job that I started at, the staff were bringing me all their problems, and I said, well, how about you start bringing me some solutions, and I think that is part of working with our mind because it is very good at problem solving if we let it. So yeah,
it's such an interesting question that you raised about having that quiet time in order to do some problem solving. And generally, we'll only make a worry session about 20 minutes, right? Yes. And then you stop it at the 20-minute mark. But the main thing is to have a daily practice at it. But this is exactly what Johann Hari was talking about in his book Stolen Focus, in our restricted ability now to have an extended period of quiet time where we can, with no distractions like these, we can actually problem solve and really reflect on things in a way that builds some insight and some enlightenment about things that are happening in our lives.
Yes, and I think starting the day, if you can, with that quiet time, it just gets you on literally the right thought pattern and everything for the day.
So there's another thing about that quiet time that I think is useful to think about, and it's about meditation. The best time to do the meditation is actually in the morning, because this raises an interesting conundrum, because I have a lot of people with insomnia who are attempting to use meditation at 2 a.m., but not necessarily realizing that meditation can give you calm alertness, not necessarily calm drowsiness. Then they're surprised that it doesn't do anything to get them back into sleep, well, partly because the intent is so, and the vigilance around that intent to get back to sleep. It's exactly what Professor Colin Espy at Glasgow University Sleep Centre talks about when he's talking about the intention to get back to sleep as marking your continued insomnia. Because the attention that goes with that intention to resume sleep actually makes, just builds further vigilance and emotional distress about being awake. And then starts to make it a distressing and pathological thing in our own minds. But so this is the interesting part about meditation. If you do meditation in the morning, you can have that relaxed alertness that's going to help you start the day with a calm, clear mind. Then just forego it at 2 a.m. because it can actually build performance anxiety about sleep at 2 a.m. That's why I never prescribe mindful meditation. And I have had people come in and say, the initial session, please, just no mindfulness. I just cannot do it. So I said, look, okay, you actually don't prescribe it. More often than not, in chronic insomnia picture, it builds performance anxiety about sleep. Can you shift it to the morning, please?
Rosemary, is there anything else you'd like to share about normal, healthy sleep before we start delving into the impact of shift work?
The core things that are done as part of a sleep hygiene process, most of your viewers have probably already seen on multiple websites. And they're the entry point. And there's a lot of good research behind the key, sleep hygiene measures. And when we talk about sleep hygiene, we're talking about those lifestyle and dietary changes that are going to be sleep conducive. That would include lifestyle changes like having a cool, dark, quiet sleep environment, dietary changes like not having caffeine within. Andrew Huberman is going so far as to say don't have it for 12 hours before you sleep, because the quarter life of caffeine is 12 hours. Matthew Walker is talking about not having caffeine for many hours. Let's think about this. By the same token, we've got hundreds of millions of Italians and Greeks and Spanish who are having a digestive espresso after dinner, and they're still getting to sleep just fine. An interesting study that just came up mid last year, and you can actually see the raw data online. That study was done by Matthew Walker and Frank Straw and looked at Scottish share traders and caffeine use and whether it actually delayed their sleep appreciably, whether it impacted the quality of their sleep. Turns out there was very little delay in their sleep, something like 16 minutes on average delay of getting into sleep if they had late caffeine intake, and it didn't affect the quality of their sleep. It's really interesting that it's one of the first things to go. Caffeine is one of the first things that people take out, even though they really enjoy it. And that's one of the first goals that I make for them in terms of a paradoxical experiment that could actually help sleep is if you really like the taste of that coffee and you've given it up, then isn't that a lose-lose situation?
There could be a lot of resentment there.
So not only do you lose the quality of life because you don't have this barista coffee that you used to really enjoy, your sleep's not getting better anyway. Or in your mind, the threat is still just as great and you're lying awake at 2 a.m., basically because that's a conditioned wakefulness period filled with trying too hard to get back to sleep. With normal sleep, we're talking about generally dark, cool, quiet sleep environment. But even then, you don't have to get that perfectly either. Some people can sleep fine on a crowded train on their way home from work. Many people can sleep on a plane without any sedatives. So you don't have to have the ideal sleep environment. And if you did have it perfectly cool, dark, and quiet, you could actually create performance anxiety about sleep. I wouldn't really start obsessing about getting the perfect sleep environment. I think just using your physiology in a sleep conducive way, using the sun foremost. The most important thing is just using the sun's rays in the morning, because the sun in the morning not only resets your circadian clock, but also your mood, because that sunlight that you see in the morning here optimizes your serotonin neurotransmission. That's serotonin, the mood neurotransmitter, and your own pineal gland will use that serotonin sleep to manufacture melatonin sleep hormone tonight as soon as it gets dark. Without supplementation, your brain and your body can do this job. We've got to remember back to when we were 5-10 years old. Generally, they don't like to give melatonin to prepubescent children because it could actually delay puberty. Generally, if you think about when you were 10 and you didn't need any supplementation or any sedatives to get to sleep, and especially on Christmas Eve when you wanted to be awake and see Santa and then just fell asleep 5 minutes later. And I don't want to trivialize this because I know there is actually such a thing. There is a diagnosis for primary childhood insomnia. For a small subset of kids is difficulty with sleep from early on, but for the vast majority of kids, we don't have to, they don't have to think about it or overthink it. They just fall into it.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the shift work aspect, I must say, Rosemary, and I've been reflecting on it, and obviously my clients come to mind, and colleagues I've worked with in the hospital system working shift work, and there's that element of needing to sleep at different times. How does that play out for people who are moving from one roster to the other?
It's easier if you can have a regular roster with predictability that you can plan for. The brain really likes routine, and the more routinized we can get it, the midbrain just starts to recognize, okay, this is the time that this happens, right? And the midbrain also, another part of the midbrain that's really important in this is your basal ganglia, which governs habit and associations and responds well to routine. evening. If it's possible, if you're doing nursing shifts, to try to get the most regularized routine possible and keep those shifts stable over time. If they're changing, I mean, the hardest thing for shift workers, because I know I've helped, done sleep therapy with shift workers in the past who had a real difficulty from Friday mornings, leaving their last shift, trying to get back, do all the admin they could on a Friday during the day, even though they're actually feeling very drowsy, and then trying to get back into the same sleep pattern as the rest of the family so they could spend weekends with the family, doing things on Saturdays and Sundays. And Sunday would be the worst day of the week, invariably, because they're going to work on the Sunday night, right? And starting their work week, and then only just got by Saturday night, just started to get back into a weekend that matches the family's pattern. It's really from, I suppose, Monday to Friday, they can get back into the swing of doing shifts from 10 until 5 a.m. But there's always the difficulty in coming home at 5 a.m., especially in the longest days of the year when you're likely to catch the rising sun rays. And remember, our retinal ganglion cells are extremely sensitive to the wavelengths of yellow and blue light when the sun's low on the eastern horizon. So we're going to be immediately responsive, because as soon as your retinal ganglion cells are registering that light information, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, this little wake-up clock deep in the brain, starts suppressing melatonin, sleep hormone. And then you get triggers a burst of cortisol that's going to give you the energy to start the day. And if you're a shift worker, you're going to be in bed and trying to sleep by 8 a.m. This is actually a difficult state of affairs. Some of the shift workers I've worked with before, if they were in a country area and driving back on a freeway after 5 a.m., trying not to see the sun, but also trying not to fall asleep. Especially scary if it's on a long, straight freeway without curves, because they're more likely to have a microsleep there. Yes. And I just remember thinking, feeling quite helpless myself, thinking, I don't know how to help them. If this person didn't sleep well on, Sunday morning, and they only had a 3-hour sleep, then I don't, they could be at risk of a microsleep. And that's just it. We actually don't have a memory or awareness for the moment we fall into sleep. That's why a microsleep on the freeway is so dangerous, right? Because we think we'll know. And so all of these things, we're having all these accoutrements of, like ice. I mean, they can't have a coffee at that point. They can't have a Diet Coke or anything because they're expecting to be asleep by 8 a.m. Or they can, they might have, say, a cold water. They might have wet face washes, have the air con up, have the music up, and it's still not enough. The wave of sleep pressure is sufficiently large, then it just overtakes you. And I know in the UK, it was a big issue for young graduate doctors who are working double shifts and then meeting with accidents on the drive home. I'm very focused with my clients on getting them to recognize sleep cues, and just see that the first dropping of the head, or, as the eyelids are starting to drop, then to just be super aware of that.
Yeah, but it's really interesting listening to you talk and having sort of heard stories from clients who, are nurses. You start to think, well, maybe the shifts are just at the wrong time. Maybe it's better to finish a shift before the sun's rising. So if you can safely get home, at least you're in bed while it's dark, before the sun's coming up, because you're quite right. A lot of shifts still are finishing at 7. So it's daylight when they're going out and by the time they get home. So it's harder to fall asleep.
It is. It's real difficulty, because at that point, circadian physiology and your response to that light means that you're suppressing melatonin, right? And if you're expecting to try to get into deep sleep imminently, in the next hour or two, this is a big issue.
Yeah, it's similar like when you're traveling overseas, and it's a long flight. So maybe you're going to Europe, and I always try to set myself on the time that I'm traveling to. And I often say to myself, that means I'm going to have a long day. And at least if I can get some sleep if it's a night flight, get some sleep at the beginning, but then it's daytime where I'm heading. So yeah, but when you have to work, that's a totally different thing, because you can't necessarily have that big sleep or go to sleep a bit earlier when you've arrived at your destination. And I've wondered also, because the other question I had for you was for midwives especially, and probably doctors who are on call once they retire, it seems to be hard for them to turn off that I'm on call. So I suspect their deep sleep is never that deep, because they're waiting for the baby to arrive or to be called into emergency surgery or something like that. So is that something that you've seen, or is there, geez, people can come and get help? Because I know of clients of mine who have been retired maybe for 6 years and they still don't have proper sleep.
And it can feel like it's untrainable, really. But I mean, I suppose the most optimistic thing about this is that everything about sleep is trainable. Like, because we can train someone who has a non-24-hour rolling circadian phase delay. They're sleeping later and later. There are a lot of younger people doing this, because our circadian physiology is it's circa 24 hours, it's circa DM, right? But it's actually really about 24 and a half hours. So that we have an ongoing tendency to phase delay if we give it free rein, according to Professor Leon Lackers at Flinders Uni Sleep Centre. You've got to be thinking of the 16 hours of wakefulness to build that homeostatic sleep pressure before your next sleep. If you're getting up later, 10 a.m. then turns into 10:30 a.m. and then 11 a.m. and then 11:30. And this happens to kids on, school holidays or uni holidays. Find yourself getting up later and later, and you're missing all of that important sunlight in the morning that was going to be protective of your mood. People can actually find their way just getting up later and later until they make their way around the clock. And we call that a non-24-hour circadian phase delay. But it's trainable. We can train it back again using bright light and melatonin administration and dim light. Everything about it is trainable if we set ourselves a task of doing that and we keep to it. And even if you've been doing shift work as a nurse for 40 years, yes, you can train back good sleep habits. I suppose if at least we can, be open-minded about what our circadian physiology can do and how strongly we respond to the sunlight, that morning sunlight will be doing a large part of the reset. Yeah. And I think the hard bit for many people is if they're thinking, I must have 8 hours sleep, they're loath to get up with the morning sun, because as a result of the years of shift work, you feel as though you can't fall asleep until 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and it's not going to budge further than that. Then you'd be unlikely to want to see a 7 a.m. sunlight. So part of it could be, if you can allow that, we will use that as your main training tool. Yes, that and your 16 hours of homeostatic sleep pressure, those two tools together will work.
Yes. So I think this is what can be confusing, even with some of the reading that I've done. So to reset our sleep clock, it's about getting up in the morning with the sun, not necessarily setting a bedtime. Would that be right?
Yes, that's the most important thing, because we can't ever guarantee your sleep onset. If you wanted to make it 10 p.m., right, we can't ever guarantee that. It wouldn't be helpful to start throwing sedatives at it to try and guarantee that, right? Because that's actually going to upset the whole thing, and sedation is not sleep, right? According to Professor Alison Harvey at UCLA Berkeley, right? So our big reset, primary reset, is actually going to be that morning sunlight. That's our handbrake on any tendency to phase delay. Even if it means that you didn't fall asleep until 3 a.m., but the sun's coming up at 6:30 or 7, it means, okay, tonight I'm just going to have to put a line under that 3.5 hour sleep, and I'm getting up. And you know what? I'm building that 16-hour wave of homeostatic sleep pressure, so I know I'm going to feel sleepy by the end of that. And that's where I'll recoup the sleep. And even better, I'm going to get more slow wave sleep if I didn't get sufficient slow wave sleep tonight. In that 3.5 hours. But this is where I do the reset. That's why the time you get up in the morning and see the sunlight is more important than the time you go to bed.
Yeah, isn't that wonderful? I thank you for explaining that. And I think it will simplify a lot of maybe the myths or misunderstandings people have had about what healthy sleep is, but also most importantly, how we reset it. And getting up with the sun sounds wonderful. I know not everyone's a morning person, but hey, we can embrace that so we can have a better sleep.
So interesting, the whole chronobiology thing. And they're doing a lot of work on this at Surrey University over in the UK. This is where they were saying that optimally, you want your slow wave sleep to be happening in nighttime hours, if you can. And this is that the thing about if you can, even between, say, 3 and 4 a.m., you've still got the darkness hours there. One of the main things they found that is probably going to be salient for shift workers is that it's Professor Jan den Dijk. It's a really unpronounceable Dutch name, sorry, so I can't recall exactly how to pronounce it. But he and his team at Surrey University were saying that we want the slow wave sleep, the deep sleep, to happen in darkness hours, because what happens in deep sleep is the space between the brain cells widens so that your cerebrospinal fluid can flush through the accumulated toxins that build up between the brain cells during our waking hours, right? That cleaning process that happens in slow wave sleep. It's incredible, really, when you think of it. Under great pressure, your cerebrospinal fluid is flushing through dense brain tissue, cleaning it out. Or cleaning out all the byproducts of oxidative stress that are building up between the brain cells during waking hours. And it accomplishes this in only 13 to 23% of the night's sleep. Wow. That is slow wave sleep. If your brain could make it any less, it would have, because we can't save ourselves. In slow wave sleep, we're not going to be able to hear the predators coming. It's just an absence for us perceptually. But what they were saying at Surrey University is that during daylight hours, your cerebrospinal fluid is diverted for other uses in the brain. This is why, if we can, after, we've been doing night shifts, if we can get back and use the daylight hours to be awake and get our slow wave sleep in darkness hours. Yeah. Even if you can only fall asleep by, so 2, 3 a.m., still going to get the benefit of that.
Yes, no, it's fascinating, and I'm sure it's an area that we're going to learn much more about, and why the circadian clock works the way that it does, which I find really fascinating, just from a digestion and metabolism point of view, let alone all the other functions that the body has. Rosemary, is there anything else you'd like to share about shift work?
I suppose the most important thing is, on your way home from finishing a 5 a.m. or 7 a.m. shift, is to use sunglasses, broad rim hats, or something to try to reduce. I know I've just talked about the sensitivity of our retinal ganglion cells for that sunlight, so you're going to pick it up anyway, even if you're wearing sunglasses. But at least try to minimize your exposure to the sun on your way home from that shift, especially if it's a 7 a.m. and shift end, and get into the room with the darkened blinds and everything. And maybe something tryptophan rich, like a warm glass of milk or something, to help you get into sleep. But again, that whole thing about it being effortless, not having to try hard, is really important. I fully accept that, because I've spoken to shift workers who live right next door to schools or in large, unit complexes with pools and everywhere, and they can hear, everyone outside, and all the kids sort of, playing in the garden and such. And so I know there are so many things that are going to make it hard for a shift worker to get to sleep. But if they can at least allow that, if they get into deep sleep, they're not going to hear these things.
That's right.
That your deep sleep can, once you're in it, your brain just wants to continue with it. And it's very hard to wake someone from deep sleep, which is going to look after your physical recovery. If you can get into sleep, then so much of that is going to be taken care of for you. It won't stop you once you're awake. After a couple of hours, say, 3 or 4 hours sleep, at that point, you are going to sort of hear any sounds in the environment that might catch your attention and make it hard for you to get back to sleep. Just be aware that your brain and your midbrain, the oldest part of your brain, is really good at getting you into sleep.
No, I like that idea of handing trust over to the natural processes, and working with all of the distractions. And probably the biggest thing that we can take away from this discussion is that some of our expectations around sleep have been incorrect, and that normal sleep isn't deep sleep for 8 hours. There is some wakefulness during the night, and even some rumination until we move our worry time to daylight hours. There's so many solutions, which is a great message to be able to share today, Rosemary.
Can I just say that one of the things that will show us the pattern is just like a sleep diary. And a sleep diary can be immediately reassuring because many people will say, I think I'm getting more sleep than I thought I was. Just doing the sleep diary and, from a felt sense of the hours slept, yes. I'm just thinking, I think maybe I'm getting more than I immediately, because we tend to broad brushstroke over this in our perception.
Yes, it's the same with mindful eating journals and the works. I tend to, after hearing my clients on coaching calls, especially small group coaching calls, very good at remembering when things didn't go right, but we tend to forget when they actually do work. And that's a lovely reason to keep a sleep journal as well, because I can sleep, I am getting sleep. And that makes it more of a kind of, how can I say, normal, I suppose, is what we're talking here, normal or natural process rather than something we feel that we're struggling with. Yeah. So, Rosemary, if people would like to reach out to you, is the website the best place to direct them to?
A good place to start, because I have links there to the different sleep centres I work at. I work at Bondi Respiratory and Sleep. I work at Sydney Sleep Centre, but I'm also doing independent work through Sleep Happen. So getting in contact with me through the website is the best way.
Yes, that's great. And I just want to let our listeners know too, and our viewers know, that you do telehealth. So it's not as if everyone has to be in Sydney to see you, which is fabulous as well, that they can get that online support.
That's right.
Yeah. Rosemary, thanks again for sharing with us today. And I'm really looking forward to the second part of our discussion, which we'll be sharing next week on sleep and menopause. But if you've been listening to us today and you have enjoyed this episode, please let us know and please share it on your social media pages. You have been listening to the Eating For You podcast with Sally Ann Pisk. If you're wanting to take weight off your mind for good without a diet, then view our free and on-demand training. The link to register is with this episode's notes.